Welcome to month 5. This is the final installment of the Wheelhouse monthly videos to finish this beauty of a quilt. I've seen so many beautiful quilts out there in the social media world, and you guys are nailing it. I hope that you've enjoyed it. We finish off pretty simply. We are just finishing these borders up here, these triangle borders. You might remember in month 2, we had you cut some width of fabric strips from the kind of lilac color of the moth fabric and cut those triangles. And then let me show you here, the thing that is going to come in together with those are these little bouquets. Now, we didn't worry too much about exact placement of cutting these. These are just general, but these we are going to fussy cut. So you can see in your monthly guide here, really teeny tiny in black and white. You can see in your monthly guide that we really specifically place those triangles right on the bouquets. And if I show you that up in the quilt, you can see like it was really intentional to try and get that little bright pink and lime green right into the edge there. And what that does, it kind of creates this nice darker border right up against the rest of this. So it creates a very beautiful border, very simple patchwork. There's also 4 little squares that go in each corner made from the same fabric. If you have a lot more of this left, you could do some moths fussy cut. I will say though, even though we didn't worry about fussy cutting these, and even though these bouquets are cut very specifically, the idea is that it's pretty regular. Do lay all of them out though. Like go ahead and on the wall or on the floor, on your dining room table, go ahead and lay out a whole row together, because you might end up with 2 of the same moth next to each other and then nothing. So make sure you're still looking for balance, even though we don't have to be overly careful about fussy cutting the moths or those floral leaves in the background. So once that's done, you are ready to just start thinking about finishing your quilt if you haven't already. Those of you that got kits that included all this fabric, you would have also gotten the echinacea fabric to cut strips widthwise to get some of all that color for the binding. My quilt actually has just a solid binding, so if you want to save this cut for something else, you're more than welcome to. Solid works just as well. But once you have your backing chosen, your binding chosen, it's time to start thinking about the quilting. This quilt was done by my friend Cindy Luby, who does all my long arm quilting. And I did a very simple kind of loop-de-loop figure 8 pattern. And I really like that on quilts where really I'm trying to focus on color and design, and the color of the thing is the thing. There are so many beautiful examples of quilts that really take into account the design and structure and the color even of the quilt, and they quilt very specifically around some parts, but I don't like highly dense quilts that have lots and lots of stitching, so I tend to go with a very simple all over pattern that really neither, it doesn't really interrupt or overly promote one section of the quilt over another. It just kind of like takes on a very basic sameness all over. And I like a kind of an open stitching, so in other words, not too much stitching, to keep my quilt supple, because we do sleep under them in my house. So I don't like sleeping under a piece of cardboard that like won't lay against you. I want to show you too, this is a different project, but one that I did hand quilt. This is a pattern that I have in the works. Those of you who have been waiting on a couple of my new patterns, you know, life and business and the pace of things have just been so different this year. So I've had to kind of push this back another month or 2, but I'll be releasing 3 new patterns. In fact, this one, it's called Natural Cadence. You could probably almost make it with a lot of the scraps. But I wanted to show it to you because of the quilting. You can see that in these applique areas, I have chosen to very specifically kind of echo quilt around those. But then because the whole quilt has sort of like a diamond pattern, I decided to very specifically go into that and do a crisscross pattern. So in other words, some of my quilting is based on the cut of the design, and then some of it just ignores the cut of the design. So when you're thinking about patterns for your quilt for hand quilting, I think it might be beautiful to do something really special on this sort of, I mean, this whole quilt is almost like a picture frame for this piece of fabric here. So maybe you do something very special and you hand quilt and shadow quilt around here. Even if you're doing long arm, you could still choose to do something special and different here. And then maybe even on these moths, since we really specifically featured them. And then perhaps other things just take on either along the seam work of the quilt, or the whole thing does its own pattern. But I think it's a really good idea to spend some time with the design thinking about it. When I do hand quilting, I use Aurifil 12 weight. It's my absolute favorite. It's the perfect weight to get kind of this larger, more primitive stitch that you saw in this design. It's faster. I would say my stitches are probably almost 1/4 of an inch long, and so is the space between them, so that the stitches on the back are that long as well. If I'm gonna go along seam lines, I try to stay about 1/4 inch away from the seam, so I'm not going through seam allowance if I can avoid it. It's just easier on the hands. Prior to starting the hand quilting, the way that I prepare it is by hand basting. I do get down on the floor and I hand baste all the layers together. If you know a long arm quilter, they can do big, huge basting stitches for you through the top, the batting, and the backing on their long arm machine. So that actually, it saves your back a bit, and then you can just spend some time quilting. When I quilt, I tend to work from the center out. I don't use a hoop, there are some resources online. I have a class on Creative Bug about whole cloth quilting, which teaches my whole technique from start to finish on hand quilting. So that's worth a look if you really want to try it for the first time. Some of you also, to really finish your quilt, would have signed up for this block of the month at your shop, and maybe they offered you the swag bag from Free Spirit, which included a couple things, but one of the things that it included was this printed little label that I designed. And I have to say, after I gave a keynote speech with the Quilters Alliance virtually last week, they are very inspiring to me in terms of documenting and preserving the history of quilting, to remind me to label my quilts. And I had to confess that I've never labeled any of my quilts, which I'm really going to start doing now. I feel committed to labeling all of my quilts, and I guess this will be the first one. But I wanted to show you here the little design. It's just a little moth design that's been printed. And even though the design is small, I asked Elizabeth before I got here today, to sew these borders on, because at home this is what I would do in order to get it into a big hoop. I don't want to have to use a teeny tiny hoop and keep moving it around. So we just sewed some simple muslin borders, two on the top and bottom, and then out to the right and left, so that we could still use a big hoop and we never have to change out the hoop once we put it on there. So you wouldn't have to embroider this, but it might be kind of a nice little detail. But because this design is so small, I'm actually going to use Aurifil 12 weight for this too. If you got this label, you would have also gotten there's like a little stitch dictionary that has a couple of basic stitches, like probably the back stitch, the chain stitch, and then these little French knots. You can use 1 or 2 strands of the Aurifil, or you could use like 2, maybe 3 strands of like a 6-strand floss to stitch this out, because all the lines are so close together. Or you could completely fill it in with a lot of like really kind of expressive stitches to fill in all those spaces solidly, instead of going right on the lines. But lots of ways to make the quilt exactly yours and no one else's. Horns. Because yeah, I mean, we've all been following this block of the month, and we've all basically made the same quilt, but I have seen some variations on what you've chosen to applique in the center. I've seen people even like applique centers of different fabric collections, but I think that's what makes the quilt special and yours, whether you hand quilted or add this little label or do your own. I hope that you've enjoyed this, and we already have next year's block of the month in the works, preparing and planning for you, and it's going to be incredible. And thank you so much for joining me on this journey of the Wheelhouse, and be well.